What made the quietest cowboy at Double Eagle risk exposing the one secret Sarah was never supposed to discover? Sarah, explain this. The forged ledger struck the camp table with a crack. 28 cowboys went silent as Daniel's hand tightened around his tin cup. Sarah turned to the one man she trusted and caught a hesitation in his eyes that made her blood run cold. What was he hiding? Stay with us and tell me where you're watching from. By the time Sarah Whitmore reached Dry Creek, the morning frost had turned the wagon ruts white. She had walked the last mile from the stage road because the driver wanted another 10 cents to carry her into town, and 10 cents mattered now. Her carpetbag bumped against her leg with every step. One boot had split along the outside seam, and cold air found the opening whenever she put her weight down. Dry Creek was not much to look at. A general store, a blacksmith shop with smoke curling from a crooked chimney, 2 saloons facing each other across a road churned hard by wagon wheels, a small hotel with a faded sign swinging above the porch. Beyond the buildings, open country rolled toward the foothills, brown grass showing through patches of early snow. Sarah stopped outside the Ellis boarding house and looked at the dark windows. For 6 months, she had worked in a kitchen much like that one in another town 30 miles south. She had baked bread before sunrise, stretched stew when travelers arrived unexpectedly, and scrubbed pots long after everyone else went to bed. Then the owner had sold the place. There had been no quarrel, no unpaid wages, no dramatic goodbye, just a folded receipt, $11 in her hand, and a simple sentence. "We won't be needing kitchen help after Saturday." Sarah had heard versions of that sentence before. She tightened her grip on the carpetbag and climbed the boarding house steps. Mrs. Margaret Ellis answered after the second knock. She was a narrow woman in her early 60s with silver hair pinned high and sleeves rolled above her wrists. "You Sarah Whitmore?" "Yes. Come in before you freeze." Warmth hit Sarah's face when the door opened. Coffee, wood smoke, onions frying somewhere in the back. For a few seconds, she wanted nothing more than to sit beside the stove and let her toes thaw. Mrs. Ellis gave her coffee in a thick white mug with a chipped blue rim and listened while Sarah explained why she had come. "I was told you might know of kitchen work." Mrs. Ellis sat across from her at a small table near the front window. "In town? Anywhere close enough to reach." The older woman rubbed one thumb over the handle of her mug. "Nothing steady here." Sarah nodded once. She had learned not to show disappointment too quickly. Some people mistook disappointment for desperation, and desperation made them lower wages. Mrs. Ellis watched her for another moment. "There is one thing." Sarah lifted her eyes. Double Eagle outfit is moving cattle north before the weather shuts the trail. Their cook took sick 2 days ago. Walter Briggs has been looking for somebody. A ranch cook? Trail cook. Sarah glanced toward the window. Outside, a gust of wind lifted loose snow from the edge of the boardwalk. "How many men?" 28, last I heard." Sarah took another sip of coffee. Mrs. Ellis noticed. "That's hard work." "I know." "You ever cooked from a chuck wagon?" "Not on a full drive." Mrs. Ellis leaned back. "That's different from a boarding house." "So was a boarding house the first day I worked in one." For the first time, the older woman's mouth moved toward a smile. "The Double Eagle crew is at the freight yard." Sarah stood. Mrs. Ellis looked at her boots. "You need those repaired." "I know. Blacksmith's wife does stitching sometimes, when I get paid." Mrs. Ellis did not offer charity. Sarah appreciated that. Instead, she reached behind the counter, pulled down a square of folded cloth, and wrapped 2 biscuits inside. "For the walk." Sarah hesitated. "Take them," Mrs. Ellis said. "They're yesterday's. If you don't eat them, I'll feed them to the chickens." That made accepting easier. Sarah slipped the bundle into her carpet bag. Thank you. The freight yard sat near the western edge of town, where the buildings thinned and the open country began. Sarah heard the men before she reached it. Harness chains rattled. Horses stamped against frozen ground. Someone shouted for a missing length of rope. A wagon wheel squealed as two men rolled it past a stack of grain sacks. The Double Eagle outfit occupied most of the yard. 3 freight wagons stood near a long loading platform. Saddles rested over fence rails. Bedrolls, canvas sacks, Dutch ovens, and wooden crates were being sorted into piles. Men moved everywhere. Sarah stopped outside the gate. A young cowboy carrying an armful of split wood saw her first. He slowed. His eyes went from her face to her coat, then lower. Sarah knew that look. She had known it since she was 16. People looked at her body before they decided what kind of woman lived inside it. The young cowboy's mouth twitched. Another man followed his gaze. Then another. "What have we got here?" someone said. The young cowboy laughed. Not cruelly at first, almost automatically. That somehow made it worse. Sarah opened the gate. The hinges squealed loud enough to turn several more heads. A heavy-set man with a dark mustache stood beside one of the wagons checking a list against the markings on several flour sacks. He looked to be in his late 50s. Weather had drawn fine lines around his eyes, and his coat had been patched so neatly at the shoulder that Sarah guessed he had repaired it himself. "Walter Briggs?" she asked. The man looked up. "That's me. My name is Sarah Whitmore. Mrs. Ellis said you're looking for a cook." The young cowboy with the wood laughed again. This time another man joined him. Sarah looked neither way. Walter Briggs folded the paper in his hand. "You've cooked trail before? I've provisioned small camps, boarding houses, worked a cattle station kitchen 2 summers when I was younger." Before Walter could answer, a voice came from behind him. "That ain't the same thing." The speaker was a man perhaps 38, broad through the chest, wearing a dark brown vest beneath his open coat. His hat sat low over close-set eyes. He had been checking the lashings on a wagon. Now he straightened. "Trail cook gets up before the crew," he said. "Goes to sleep after them. Wagon breaks, cook handles it. Fire won't catch, cook figures it out. Men ride 14 hours. They don't care about excuses when supper's late." Sarah looked at him. "I didn't ask what they care about." A couple of men went quiet. The man gave a short laugh. "No? No? I asked if there was work." Walter's eyes flicked briefly toward the other man. "Roy Dalton, assistant trail boss." Sarah gave Roy a single nod. Roy looked her over slowly. Not with interest, with calculation. "You're going to have trouble keeping up with that wagon," he said. Sarah knew exactly what he meant. She let him say it. Roy seemed disappointed that she did not make him finish. The young cowboy by the woodpile muttered something to another hand. Sarah heard the word "woman" and another burst of laughter. She set her carpet bag on the frozen ground. The sound was small, but it drew everyone's attention back to her. "What food have you got?" she asked. Walter blinked. "What?" "For the crew. What food is left?" Roy folded his arms. "You planning supper already?" "I'm asking what's available." Walter studied her. Before he answered, his eyes moved past Sarah toward the hitching rail. She followed the glance. A man stood there beside a bay horse. He had been there the entire time, but Sarah had not noticed him because he had done nothing to draw attention. He looked a few years past 30, lean rather than broad. Gray coat buttoned nearly to the throat. Dark hat. Gloves tucked through his belt. His face was quiet. So were his eyes. He had not laughed. That was the first thing Sarah noticed. The second was that Walter Briggs, a man who appeared to take orders from nobody easily, had looked at him before making a decision that had nothing to do with him. The quiet cowboy met Walter's gaze. Neither spoke. Roy noticed it too. His jaw tightened slightly. Walter looked back at Sarah. Beans, salt pork, some beef, flour, though a couple sacks split during loading, coffee, onions, dried peppers, molasses maybe. Supplies are half sorted. Stove, chuck box and Dutch ovens. Fire pit here in the yard. Wood? The young cowboy was still holding it. Sarah pointed toward him. He seems to have some. Several men laughed. This time the laughter was different. The young cowboy's ears turned red. Walter's mouth almost moved. Almost. Roy stepped closer. This isn't a town kitchen, Mrs. Whitmore. Miss. What, Miss Whitmore? He stared at her. Sarah continued. And I'm aware this isn't a town kitchen. You think 28 men are going to wait while you figure things out? No. Then what makes you think you can feed them? Sarah looked around the yard. Men had stopped pretending to work. Some leaned against wagons. One sat on a grain sack. The young cowboy still had the wood in his arms. All of them were waiting to see whether she would defend herself. Sarah had done that too many times in her life. She was tired of giving speeches to people who had already decided what she was. So she didn't. Instead, she looked at Walter. What time do they eat? Walter glanced toward the sky. Usually 6. Sarah checked the little watch pinned inside her coat. It was barely afternoon. Then you've got nearly 6 hours to decide whether I'm worth paying. Roy scoffed. Walter rubbed his jaw. The wind moved through the freight yard and snapped a loose corner of canvas against one of the wagons. Sarah waited. She did not cross her arms, did not plead, did not promise she would surprise them. She simply stood beside her carpetbag with cold leaking through her broken boot and watched Walter make up his mind. Finally, he said, "Sundown." Roy turned. "Walter." "She feeds the outfit tonight," Walter continued. "If the men eat it and we've got enough left for the morning, we'll talk about the drive." Roy's face hardened. "You're serious?" "I usually am." Sarah bent for her carpetbag. Walter stopped her. "You won't need that yet." She straightened. He reached inside his coat. For a moment, Sarah thought he was going to give her money. Instead, Walter looked again toward the quiet cowboy by the hitching rail. That second glance bothered Sarah more than the first. Something was passing between them. Something she didn't understand. Roy saw it too. The quiet cowboy finally pushed away from the rail. He walked toward them without hurry. Up close, Sarah saw the fine dust settled into the seams of his coat and an old scar across one knuckle. Working hands. Nothing about him looked wealthy. Nothing about him looked important. Walter held a ring of small iron keys. Before he could speak, the cowboy did. "Give her the keys." His voice was low, plain, not commanding. Yet Walter placed the keys d'assaut in Sarah's hand. Roy stared at him. Sarah looked down at the cold iron against her palm, then back at the man. He had already turned toward the horses. She watched him go. "Who is he?" she asked. Walter paused. "Daniel Cooper." "Another trail hand?" Walter looked after Daniel for half a second too long. Then he said, "You've got until sundown, Miss Whitmore." Sarah closed her fingers around the keys. Whatever Daniel Cooper was, she could worry about it later. 28 hungry cowboys were expecting her to fail before supper. That was a problem she understood. Sarah carried the ring of iron keys across the freight yard, and stopped beside the chuck wagon. Up close, it looked worse than it had from the gate. One wheel leaned slightly inward. The canvas cover had been patched twice. A cabinet built into the back held tin plates, coffee pots, spice tins, knives, and enough old grease to prove nobody had properly scrubbed it in months. 2 Dutch ovens sat beneath the wagon tongue, their lids rimmed with ash from the last cook fire. Henry Cole, the young cowboy who had laughed first, followed her with the bundle of split wood still in his arms. Sarah glanced at him. "You planning to hold that until supper?" His grin faded. "Where do you want it?" "By the fire pit." He carried it over. She unlocked the provision chest. Walter had described the supplies accurately, but not generously. One flour sack had torn along the bottom seam and been tied shut with baling twine. Another had gotten damp somewhere along the road and hardened into lumps at one corner. The beans were sound. The onions were small but firm. There were 3 strings of dried red peppers, a crock of molasses, a slab of salt pork, and several cuts of beef wrapped in canvas. Sarah unwrapped the largest piece. Tough shoulder. Good flavor if given enough time. Not much time. She checked the sky. A little after noon. "Henry." He looked over. "Yes?" "Find me 2 clean buckets." He hesitated. "Why?" Sarah looked at him. He cleared his throat. "Right." He went. Roy Dalton stood near one of the freight wagons pretending to inspect a harness buckle. Sarah could feel him watching. She ignored him. She trimmed the beef with a narrow knife from the chuck box, cutting away gristle and slicing the meat smaller than she normally would. Smaller pieces would soften faster. She set the salt pork into a skillet and rendered enough fat to coat the bottom of the Dutch oven. The smell brought the first curious cowboy closer. Samuel Price stopped about 10 feet away. He was older than most of the men, broad in the shoulders, his beard going gray along the chin. "What are you making?" "Supper." "I gathered that." Sarah tossed onions into the hot pork fat. They hissed. Samuel looked toward the beef. "That's shoulder." "It is. Needs half a day. Not cut this size." He looked at her, then at the pot. "Maybe." Sarah turned the onions. "That's a useful amount of confidence." Samuel gave a dry grunt and walked off. Henry returned carrying 2 buckets. "Water pumps behind the blacksmith shed," he said. "Fill both." He frowned at the pots. "You want me to haul water too?" "No. I want the water to haul itself, but it doesn't seem inclined." Someone behind him laughed. Henry's face colored. He took the buckets. This time, Sarah almost smiled. By 1 o'clock, she had the beef browning. By 1:30, the beans were boiling in a second pot with onions, dried peppers, and pieces of salt pork. She sifted what flour she could save through a mesh strainer found in the chuck box, broke apart the hardened lumps with the back of a spoon, and tested the Dutch oven lids for fit. Roy came closer. "You're using too much wood." Sarah did not look up. "I'm using enough. Trail wood isn't free. Neither is undercooked beef." Roy stared at her. She pressed flour into a bowl. "The drive starts tomorrow," he said. "You won't have a woodpile every time you want one. Then tomorrow I'll cook differently." "You always got an answer?" "No." That made him pause. Sarah added salt. "Only when I know one." Roy walked away without replying. From the hitching rail, Daniel Cooper had seen the exchange. Sarah noticed only because when she looked up, he was already looking at the fire. Not her. The fire. He walked over after Roy left and crouched beside the wagon wheel. Sarah kept working. Daniel put one gloved hand against the iron rim and gave it a short push. The wheel shifted. He looked toward the axle. "Brake pin's loose." "I noticed." He glanced up at her. When? When I opened the chuck box. Wagon settled when I stepped on the back rail. He nodded once. No surprise. No praise. Just acceptance. Then he stood and moved away. That was somehow more unsettling than if he had complimented her. At 3, the yard smelled different. The beef had softened enough to pull apart with a fork. The beans were thickening. Sarah mixed flour with rendered fat and water, worked it quickly, and shaped rough biscuits by hand. Henry appeared again. Need anything? She looked at him. He looked embarrassed by the question. More wood, she said. He nodded and went without a joke. The first batch of biscuits came out darker on one edge than she wanted. Sarah turned the Dutch oven and adjusted the coals. Samuel Price wandered past again. He glanced at the biscuits. Burned. Some. He picked one up. Sarah slapped the back of his hand with the wooden spoon. Those are not yours. Samuel stared at her. The men nearby went silent. Then Samuel started laughing. A slow, surprised laugh. All right, he said. Fair. By 5:30, shadows had lengthened across the freight yard. The men had mostly finished loading. Saddles were stacked. Bedrolls were rolled tight and tied. Horses stood nose down near the rail, steam rising from their nostrils. Sarah set the food out without ceremony. Beef stew, beans, biscuits, coffee. Nothing fancy, nothing pretending to be. Walter Briggs entered the circle first and filled a tin plate. Roy followed. Then Samuel. Henry hovered until Sarah handed him a plate. You carried enough wood to earn the first biscuit. He smiled despite himself. The others came. At first there was still some talking, then less, then almost none. Sarah stood beside the coffee pot and watched men eat. A spoon scraped against tin. A boot shifted on frozen ground. Someone coughed. The wind rattled the loose canvas flap on the wagon. Henry finished first. He looked at his empty plate, then toward the Dutch oven. Sarah lifted her chin. There's more. He got up immediately. 2 other men followed. Samuel returned for beans. Then one of the men Sarah had not yet learned the name of came back for another biscuit. Roy remained seated. He ate everything on his plate. That told her more than anything he might have said. Walter wiped his mouth with the back of his glove. Coffee's strong. Is that a complaint? No. Then I'll keep making it that way. Walter looked around at the men. You still hungry? Nobody answered. Henry had food in his mouth. Samuel shook his head. Walter looked at Sarah. Breakfast at 4:30. She held his gaze. So I'm staying. You're feeding the drive tomorrow. Roy set his plate down harder than necessary. Walter continued. If you can keep this up on the trail, we'll settle wages at the end of the first week. Sarah nodded. Fair. That was all. No applause. No apology from the men who had laughed. She preferred it that way. Work had been asked for. Work had been done. After dark, the freight yard emptied. Most of the crew went toward the boarding houses and cheap rooms around town for one last night under a roof. Walter stayed behind, checking manifests by lantern light. Sarah cleaned the Dutch ovens with hot water and coarse salt, dried them over the coals, and rubbed the inside lightly with pork fat before packing them. Her hands ached by the time she finished. She carried the last bucket toward the wagon. A metallic tapping came from beneath it. Sarah stopped. Daniel Cooper lay on his back under the rear axle, one shoulder against the frozen dirt. A small lantern sat beside him. He had removed one glove and was working the brake assembly with a short wrench. She set the bucket down. I told you I saw that. I know. I could have fixed it. He tightened something. I know. Sarah crossed her arms. Then why are you under my wagon? He slid out far enough to look up at her. Because the pin was half worn through, and you've been cooking since noon. I don't need rescuing. Daniel looked at her for a moment. Then he held the wrench out handle first. I never claimed you did. Sarah stared at the tool. He waited. Finally, she took it. Daniel moved aside and pointed beneath the axle. See that retaining nut? She crouched. The ground was cold through her skirt. Yes. Hold it while I seat the new pin. She fitted the wrench. For the next several minutes, they worked without talking. No flirtation, no teasing. Just two people fixing a wagon by lantern light. When they finished, Daniel spun the wheel once and tested the brake. It held clean. Sarah stood and brushed dirt from her palms. Thank you. He nodded. You did most of it. She looked at him. You were underneath the wagon. You held the nut. That's not most of it. The corner of his mouth moved. Barely. Depends who writes the account. He picked up the lantern and walked toward the hitching rail. Sarah watched him go longer than she meant to. Then she caught herself and went back to the chuck wagon. Before dawn, Dry Creek was black except for a few lamps in boarding house windows. Sarah had slept 3 hours in a narrow room Mrs. Ellis rented her for almost nothing. At 4, she was back at the freight yard with her coat buttoned tight and a scarf over her hair. Coffee boiled. Salt pork hissed. The first biscuits were already browning when she heard voices beyond the wagon. Walter and Daniel. Sarah stepped around the rear wheel with a sack of cornmeal in her arms. Walter stood close to Daniel beside the rail. He was holding a sealed telegram. Daniel took it. Walter lowered his voice. Sarah could not hear the first words. Then the wind shifted. That came for you personally, Walter said. Daniel looked down at the envelope. Walter added something quieter. Sarah only caught the last 2 words. Your decision. There it was again. That tone. Not the way a trail boss spoke to a senior hand. The way a man spoke to somebody whose answer mattered more than his own. Daniel tucked the telegram inside his coat. Then he looked up. Straight at Sarah. For 1 second, neither moved. She had the cornmeal sack against her hip. He had the sealed message hidden inside his coat. Walter glanced between them. Sarah turned back toward the fire. But the question stayed with her. Who exactly was Daniel Cooper? Sarah carried it with her through breakfast. The men came in from the cold in 2s and 3s, stamping their boots against the freight yard planks and wrapping both hands around tin cups while steam rolled off the coffee. Walter moved among them with his list tucked inside his coat, checking names, horses, bedrolls, ammunition, rope, and wagon loads before the light had properly reached the street. Daniel came last. He looked no different than he had the day before. Gray coat, dark hat, same quiet face, no sign of the telegram, no sign that Walter had spoken to him like a man whose opinion could settle something important. He filled his own cup, took a biscuit, and stood near the edge of the fire while the others ate. Sarah caught him looking toward her once, not staring, just checking. When their eyes met, Daniel gave a small nod. She gave one back. Then Walter shouted for the outfit to move. Dry Creek woke around them as harness chains tightened and wheels began to turn. Shopkeepers opened shutters. A dog barked from behind the blacksmith shed. Mrs. Ellis stood outside her boarding house in a shawl and lifted one hand when Sarah's wagon rolled past. Sarah waved. Then the town fell behind. The first miles were easy. The trail ran north over rolling ground, where frost silvered the grass and low hills opened toward the mountains. The herd stretched ahead in a loose moving mass, dark backs and pale horns shifting through the morning haze. Sarah drove the chuck wagon with the reins looped through gloved hands. Walter had given her a steady pair of sorrel horses, old enough not to frighten easily, and smart enough to avoid holes when she let them choose their footing. Henry rode beside her for part of the morning. "You ever drive a wagon this big?" "Not this big." He looked at the wheels. "Comforting." Sarah glanced over. "You ever been thrown from a horse?" "Twice. And you still ride." Henry considered that. Fair enough. By noon, the easy ground ended. The trail narrowed where it climbed through a rocky cut, and Sarah learned quickly that a chuck wagon behaved differently once its wheels started dropping into ruts. Every loose pan became noise. Every crate became a threat. The first time the wagon lurched hard enough to shift a flour sack, she stopped and climbed down. Daniel rode back from the herd. "Trouble?" "Packing." She opened the rear cabinet. One sack had split at the corner. White flour dusted the floorboards and one of the Dutch oven lids. Sarah closed her eyes for 1 second. Not from despair. Calculation. She tore a strip from an empty grain sack, folded it over the split seam, and stitched it down with waxed thread from her carpet bag. Daniel watched from his saddle. She felt it. "You got something to say?" "Not yet." She tied the repaired sack lower in the wagon. "Now? Put the heavier goods against the axle. I know that. You know it now." Sarah looked at him. He almost smiled. Almost. She moved 2 crates and retied the load. Daniel dismounted and pointed toward the rear braces. "Run the rope through there next time." "Why?" "Stops the crates walking sideways on bad ground." He showed her once. Then he handed her the rope. Sarah retied the whole rear load herself. Daniel did not touch it again. When she finished, he tested one knot with 2 fingers. "That'll hold." No praise, no lecture. He mounted and rode back toward the herd. Sarah watched him go, annoyed that she appreciated the way he had handled it. By late afternoon, the wind had picked up. Cooking supper became a fight. The fire kept leaning sideways, smoke blowing into Sarah's face until her eyes watered. She built a low stone break around the pit and moved the Dutch ovens closer together to hold heat. The first pan of biscuits came out black along the bottom. Sarah stared at them. Henry wandered over. "Those look dangerous." She broke one in half. The inside was fine. "Scrape the bottoms." Henry blinked. "That's it?" "That's it. They're burned. They're food." He took one. "Not bad." "Don't sound surprised." The next batch came out better. By the third evening, Sarah understood more than she had on the first. The cattle set the schedule, not the clock. If the herd moved early, breakfast moved earlier. If the cattle watered late, supper waited. If the men rode hard all afternoon, the coffee needed to be ready before anyone asked. She began cooking by the rhythm of the trail. At first she had thought 28 men would be the difficult part. The hard part was 28 men arriving hungry at 28 slightly different times. She adapted. A pot of beans stayed warm. Coffee never went fully cold. Biscuits were held back for whoever came off the late watch. Daniel was usually one of them. The first time she left him coffee deliberately, she said nothing. She simply filled an extra tin cup and set it near the edge of the fire before going to check the bread dough. He came in after midnight with frost on his coat and found it there. He looked at the cup, then at her. Sarah kept kneading. "It's still hot." Daniel picked it up. "Thank you." That was all. The next morning, when she climbed onto the wagon before dawn, her water barrel was full. She knew she had left it half empty. She looked around. Henry was tightening a cinch. Samuel was checking a mare's left forefoot. Walter was speaking to Roy. Daniel was rolling a bedroll beside the fire. Sarah climbed down. She walked over. "You filled the barrel?" Daniel kept tying the bedroll. "Maybe." "That's not an answer. It has water in it. I can see that." He tightened the final strap. "Then we've solved the important part." Sarah looked at him for a moment. There was no grin on his face, no expectation. He wasn't waiting for thanks. She went back to the wagon. The next night, another cup of coffee was waiting by the fire when Daniel came off watch. Neither of them mentioned that either. The trail carried them farther from Dry Creek. Town roads disappeared. The world narrowed into cattle tracks, creek bottoms, sagebrush flats, and long stretches of open ground beneath a sky that seemed too large to belong to anyone. At night, coyotes called beyond the herd. The men slept in bedrolls under canvas when weather allowed, and beneath wagon shelter when it did not. Sarah slept near the chuck wagon, wrapped in 2 blankets with her carpetbag beneath her head. Some nights she heard Daniel's boots near the fire long after the others settled. She never knew whether he was keeping watch or simply awake. Roy noticed everything. That became clear on the 6th day. Sarah was portioning salt pork when Henry came up beside the wagon. He looked uncomfortable. "Can I ask you something? If it's foolish, I'd rather you didn't." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Roy says Cooper's making things easier for you." Sarah stopped cutting. "How?" "I don't know. Water. Fixing things. Talking to Walter." She set the knife down. "Did Roy say why that matters?" Henry looked toward the herd. "He says you're getting special treatment because Daniel's taken a shine to you." Sarah's face stayed still. Inside, something tightened. Not because of Daniel. Because she had heard versions of this before. A woman did good work, and sooner or later somebody decided a man must be the reason she was allowed to keep doing it. She picked the knife back up. "What do you think?" Henry shifted. "I think supper's been on time every night." "Then hold on to that thought." He nodded. Later, Roy came by the wagon while she was tying down the spice chest. "Cooper helping you again?" Sarah did not look up. "He works here. He's been working near your wagon an awful lot." She pulled the rope tight. "Do you keep records of where every man stands?" Roy smiled without warmth. "Just noticing." "So am I." That ended the conversation. But after he walked away, Sarah looked toward Daniel. He was half a field off, helping Samuel turn 2 straying steers back toward the herd. From that distance, he looked exactly like what he claimed to be. A cowboy. Nothing more. Yet Walter still consulted him before campsites were chosen. And twice Sarah had heard Daniel mention cattle numbers he had no reason to know so precisely. 3,400 head in the north herd. 612 moved last spring. Numbers that sounded less like campfire knowledge and more like bookkeeping. That evening, Walter rode ahead to check the next water stop. He returned just before sunset. His face was tight. The men gathered near the chuck wagon while Sarah stirred stew. "Safe crossing's gone," Walter said. Samuel frowned. "Which one?" "Red Willow." A few men swore under their breath. Walter took off one glove and pointed toward the north. "Runoff came down early from the high country. Water's over the banks." Roy stepped forward. "We turn east." "Adds 2 days," Walter said. "We lose 2 days or lose a wagon." Walter shook his head. "Weather's building over the western ridge. We don't have 2 days." Henry looked toward Sarah's wagon. "So what do we do?" Walter was quiet for a moment. "Blackwater Ford." Nobody spoke. Sarah had heard the name once in Dry Creek. Mrs. Ellis had mentioned it while explaining the trail. A broad river crossing with a rock shelf underneath, and a fast center channel that got treacherous when runoff rose. Samuel broke the silence. Water'll be high there too. Probably. Roy looked at Walter. You willing to risk the chuck wagon? Walter's eyes went toward Daniel. Again. That small movement. That same pause before an answer. Daniel stood near the remuda with one hand on his saddle horn. He looked at Walter, then toward the wagon, then at Sarah, not at the cattle, not at the men, at her. Sarah felt it even across the camp. Walter followed his gaze. We cross at first light, he said. The men started moving again, quietly this time. Sarah turned back to the stew, but her hand had tightened around the spoon. Blackwater Ford waited somewhere beyond the dark hills, and Daniel Cooper was already looking at her wagon as though he knew exactly what tomorrow could cost. Sarah slept badly. The camp settled after supper, but not easily. Men checked cinches twice. Walter walked the horse line with a lantern. Roy and Samuel argued quietly over whether the lead cattle should cross in smaller bunches. Every so often, a steer lowed somewhere in the dark, and another answered. Sarah lay beneath her blankets beside the chuck wagon and listened. The river was still miles away. She could almost hear it anyway. Before dawn, she was up. She made coffee strong enough to pull men fully awake and fried salt pork in 2 pans while the sky slowly turned from black to iron gray. Nobody complained about the food. Nobody lingered over it either. Walter ate standing. Keep the wagon light, he told Sarah. I already moved the flour forward and tied the loose crates. Good. Anything else? He looked toward the eastern ridge. Listen when we get there. Sarah nodded. Daniel came for coffee. His gloves were wet with frost. She filled his cup. You've crossed it before? Blackwater? Yes. A few times. How bad? He looked at the coffee for a moment before answering. Depends what the river decided overnight. That was not comforting. Sarah gave him a flat look. Daniel drank, you asked. They broke camp before sunrise. The trail descended gradually through a stand of cottonwoods and then opened into low country where frozen grass bent beneath the wind. By mid-morning, Sarah began hearing water, not the soft sound of a creek, a broad, constant rushing. The road turned. Blackwater Ford appeared below them. Sarah pulled the horses to a stop. The river was wider than she expected. Brown water rolled hard between pale banks crusted with ice. In the middle, the current darkened where the channel deepened. Rocks broke the surface in several places, sending white water around them. Walter rode down first with Samuel and Daniel. They entered without the wagon. Sarah watched the horses. Water climbed past their knees, then nearly to their bellies before easing again on the far side. Roy swore under his breath. Too high. Walter rode back. We can make it. Roy looked toward the wagon. You hope. We're not turning 2 days east. Walter pointed to the men. Move the herd in groups. Keep them wide. Don't bunch them in the channel. The first cattle entered. For nearly an hour, Sarah watched men push the herd across. It was ugly, noisy work. Cattle balked at the bank. Horses slipped on wet stones. Men shouted over the river. A young steer turned downstream and had to be driven back toward the shallows. But the herd crossed. Then came the wagons. The first freight wagon made it with water reaching almost to the wagon bed. The second hit a stone and jolted hard enough to throw a crate, but the wheel held. Then Walter rode to Sarah. You're next. She tightened her gloves. Daniel appeared on the other side of the wagon. I'll ride left. Roy came up on the right. I'll take the team if she loses them. Sarah looked at him. I won't. Roy gave a small shrug. We'll see. Walter cut him a hard glance. Just do your job. Sarah climbed onto the driver's seat. The sorrels were already restless. She took the reins short. Daniel rode close enough for her to hear him over the river. Don't fight them unless you have to. I know. Let them feel the bottom. I know. His eyes stayed on hers for 1 second. Then he nodded. All right. The wagon rolled down the bank. The first touch of water made the horses hesitate. Sarah gave them their heads. They stepped in. The current struck the wheels sideways. The wagon shifted. She felt it immediately through the seat. A hard pull to the left. The horses kept moving. Water climbed, up to the hubs, then higher. One wheel rolled over a rock and dropped. The wagon lurched violently. A crate slammed against the inside wall. Sarah caught herself with one hand. Keep them straight! Walter shouted from ahead. She pulled the right rein. The sorrels fought the current. Then the left rear wheel dropped again. This time it did not rise. The wagon stopped. The horses strained. Wood groaned behind her. Daniel turned in the water. Rock shelf. Sarah looked back. The wagon had tilted enough that 2 supply crates were sliding toward the lower side. One struck the railing. The next would go over. Daniel was beside her almost immediately. Can you hold the team? Sarah stared at him. Yes. Good. He dismounted into the river. The water hit him above the thigh. Roy shouted something about unhitching the team. Daniel ignored him. He moved toward the trapped wheel, one hand on the wagon. Sarah wrapped the reins around her forearms and leaned back. The sorrels tossed their heads. Easy, she said. The current pushed harder. The wagon shifted another inch. A flour crate slid. Sarah kicked it back with one boot while keeping the reins taut. Daniel crouched beside the wheel. Water broke against his chest. Stones under the rim, he shouted. What do you need? Hold them exactly where they are. Sarah tightened her grip. The reins cut into her gloves. One horse tried to swing downstream. She corrected him. Stand. The team shook. Steam rose from their bodies. Daniel reached beneath the wheel. Samuel rode in from the far side. Need a rope? Not yet. Daniel shifted something. The wagon jerked. Sarah nearly lost one rein. She caught it against her wrist. Again! Daniel shouted. The horses lunged. The wheel rose half an inch, then slipped back. Roy rode closer. This is wasting time. Cut the traces and save the team. Sarah heard him. Daniel did too. No. Roy shouted, You lose the wagon! You lose the food! Daniel looked up at Sarah. One more. She nodded. Not because he was telling her what to do, because they both knew exactly what the other was trying. Daniel braced against the wheel. Samuel took hold of the rear frame. Sarah gathered the reins. Come on. The sorrels leaned into the harness. For 1 second, nothing moved. Then the wheel climbed. The wagon came free hard enough to throw Daniel sideways into the current. Sarah's heart stopped. He caught the side rail. Samuel grabbed his coat. The wagon surged forward. Sarah kept the horses straight. Move! They did. The water lowered. The wheels found firmer ground. Then the chuck wagon climbed the opposite bank and rolled onto gravel. Sarah stopped only when Walter shouted for her to stop. She sat frozen on the driver's seat. Her hands would not open. The reins were still wrapped around them. Daniel came up beside the wagon, soaked from the waist down. You can let go now. Sarah looked at him. I know. Her fingers did not move. Daniel climbed onto the step. Slowly, without touching her hands, he loosened the reins where they had twisted around her wrists. That was all. No fuss. No telling her she should have gotten off the wagon. No remark about how close it had been. He handed the reins back. You held them. Sarah swallowed. So did you. Daniel glanced toward the wheel. Wheel did most of the complaining. She laughed once. It escaped before she could stop it. His mouth moved at the corner. Then Walter called him. He climbed down and walked away, dripping river water into the gravel. That evening, they camped in a stand of cottonwoods above the ford. Sarah made stew with more pepper than usual because everyone had spent too long cold and wet. After supper, she stood beside the fire pouring coffee. Her hands had finally stopped aching. They had not stopped trembling. The pot shook enough that coffee splashed over the rim of Daniel's cup. Sarah frowned. I'm fine. I didn't say anything. She tried again. The pot shook harder. Daniel reached out. For 1 second, she thought he was going to take the cup from her. Instead, he took the coffee pot. He held it while she kept the cup. The difference was so small most people would not have noticed. Sarah did. He poured, then handed the pot back. No comment. No pity. She looked at him. Why did you trust me with the team? Daniel leaned one shoulder against the wagon wheel. Because you said you could hold them. That's it? Should there be more? Most men would have told me to get off. Most men weren't driving your wagon. Sarah looked down into her cup. Firelight moved across the black surface of the coffee. You really thought I could do it? Daniel's answer came without hesitation. Because you told me you could. She looked at him again. Something in her face must have changed because he went quiet. For a moment, neither moved. The sounds of camp seemed farther away than they were. A horse chewing hay, Samuel coughing near the fire, Walter giving Henry instructions about the morning watch. Daniel finally stepped back. Get some rest. Sarah nodded. He walked toward the far side of camp. She watched him until Walter intercepted him behind the supply wagon. The two men stood partly hidden by the canvas. Sarah turned away. Then Walter's voice carried through the cold air. Low, sharp. You can't keep pretending you're just another hand forever. Sarah stopped. Daniel answered too quietly for her to hear. Walter said something else. Then Daniel stepped into view. His face had gone still. He saw Sarah standing by the fire. For one long second, all three of them knew she had heard something. Daniel did not explain. Sarah did not ask. But the question she had been carrying since Dry Creek suddenly became something heavier. Daniel Cooper was hiding more than a telegram. Sarah did not ask him about it the next morning. That surprised her. She had never been shy about direct questions, but there was something about the way Walter had said those words that made her hold back. You can't keep pretending you're just another hand forever. The sentence stayed with her while she packed the coffee tins. It stayed with her when Daniel rode past the chuck wagon without looking over. It stayed with her when Walter sent 3 men ahead to scout a better camp near the foothills and asked Daniel, not Roy, which creek crossing would give the cattle the least trouble. Daniel answered without hesitation. Take Miller's Cut. Ground's firmer on the west side. Walter nodded. Roy's mouth tightened. Sarah noticed that too. By noon, the trail rose gradually toward country rougher than anything they had crossed so far. The mountains seemed closer now. Snow lay white along the higher ridges, while the lower slopes were dark with pine. The wind smelled different up there, colder, cleaner. They passed a small freight outfit traveling south. One of the men riding with it pulled up when he saw Daniel. Cooper. Daniel reined in. The man wore a town coat beneath a buffalo hide vest and had a leather document case strapped behind his saddle. Didn't expect to find you out here? Daniel's face changed almost imperceptibly. Morning, Mr. Lawson. The livestock buyer looked toward Walter, then back at Daniel. Your numbers came through. Daniel's eyes flicked toward Sarah's wagon. Sarah turned back to the reins before either man could see that she was listening. Good, Daniel said. Strong price, too. Better than Cheyenne. Send the receipt through the usual channel. Lawson nodded. Of course. Then he tipped his hat with a politeness men rarely gave ordinary ranch hands. Good seeing you, Mr. Cooper. Sarah heard the mister. So did Roy. When the freight outfit moved on, Roy rode closer to Daniel. What numbers? Business, whose? Daniel looked at him. Roy gave a short laugh. Forget I asked. Sarah kept the horses moving. She wanted to turn around and demand an explanation. Instead, she let the moment settle. By evening, they reached a sheltered stretch of ground beneath a long pine ridge. Walter called camp early because the cattle had traveled hard since Blackwater Ford. Sarah welcomed the extra hour. She had bread to make, beans to soak, coffee tins to count. She also wanted something that had nothing to do with work. Time. Daniel came to the cook fire after dark. Most of the men had finished eating and wandered toward their bedrolls. Henry and Samuel were playing cards on an overturned crate. Roy sat with two riders near the edge of camp, speaking low. Sarah was wiping down the long board used as a prep table. Daniel set his plate in the wash basin. You've been quiet. Sarah looked at him. Have I? More than usual. Maybe I'm learning from you. His mouth moved faintly. Poor habit to pick up. She folded the cloth. Sit. He did. Not immediately. He looked at her once as if checking whether she meant it, then took the far end of the bench. Sarah poured herself coffee, then him. The fire had burned low enough that the light softened the camp around them. Beyond the wagons, the cattle settled in dark shapes across the ground. For a while, neither spoke. It was the kind of quiet Sarah had started to recognize with Daniel. Not empty, not demanding. Just there. She turned her cup between both hands. What did you do before this? Daniel looked at her. This? Ranch work. I've always done ranch work. That's not an answer. It's technically an answer. She gave him a look. He surrendered a little. My father had cattle. Had? He's dead. Sarah lowered her eyes. I'm sorry. It was years ago. That doesn't always matter. Daniel looked at the fire. No. The word was quiet. She waited. He said, He left me more responsibility than sense. There it was. Not enough to explain anything. Enough to make her more curious. What kind of responsibility? Danielson took a drink of coffee. The kind that keeps a man awake. Sarah leaned back. You do that often, what? Answer questions without answering them. I told you the truth. You told me the edge of it. He looked at her then. The firelight caught one side of his face. Maybe the edge is what I know how to give. Sarah did not push. Instead, she looked toward the mountains. I wanted an eating house once. Daniel's attention shifted fully to her. In Dry Creek? No. Somewhere bigger. She ran one finger along the rim of her cup. Nothing fancy. 6 tables, maybe. Good coffee. Bread that didn't taste like saddle leather. Soup every day, whether anybody asked for it or not. Why soup? Because people come in cold. Daniel nodded as though that answered everything. What happened? Sarah smiled without much humor. Life, that's broad. So was your answer. Fair. He looked back toward the fire. Sarah continued. I worked for people instead. Boarding houses, camps, way stations. Sometimes the pay was good. Sometimes it wasn't. The dream got smaller. Did it go away? She was quiet. No. Daniel said nothing. That was one of the things she had begun to like about him. He did not tell her she should open the place, did not promise the world was waiting. He simply received the truth. Sarah looked down at her hands. I've spent a lot of years being useful to people. Daniel waited. They liked what I could do, a pause. Cooking, cleaning, keeping things running. She swallowed. But that isn't always the same as wanting to know the person doing it. Daniel's eyes stayed on her. Sarah gave a small shrug. Some men especially. His answer came softly. Then they weren't paying attention. The words landed harder than they should have. Sarah looked up. Daniel did not look away. For a second, the whole camp seemed to contract around them. The fire cracked. A horse shook its mane somewhere behind the wagons. Henry laughed at something Samuel said, but the sound felt far off. Daniel's hand rested on the bench between them. Not reaching. Just there. Sarah's breath caught slightly. She hated that he probably noticed. Maybe he did. Maybe that was why he moved so carefully. He leaned toward her. Not far. Just enough that the distance changed. Sarah could smell coffee and cold air on his coat. She should have moved first. Instead, she stayed. His eyes dropped once to her mouth, then back to her eyes. That was when she stepped away. Not sharply. She simply stood. I need to check the bread. Daniel remained seated. He did not apologize, did not chase the moment, did not make it awkward by pretending nothing had happened. He only nodded. All right. Sarah turned toward the Dutch oven. Her hands were steady. Barely. She lifted the lid. The bread was fine. She checked it anyway. Behind her, Daniel stood. Good night, Sarah. She looked over her shoulder. Good night. He left. She watched him cross the camp and disappear beyond the firelight. Then she let out the breath she had been holding. The next morning came bitter and clear. Sarah was up before the stars had faded. She reached for the provision chest. The lock was hanging loose. She froze. She had closed it the night before. She knew she had. Sarah pulled the lid open. For a second, she could not understand what she was seeing. Then she did. The coffee tins were wrong. 2 were gone. The flour sacks were wrong too. 1 missing entirely. Another reduced by half. Sarah began counting. Again. Then a third time. Nearly a week's worth. Gone. She straightened slowly. The camp was only beginning to stir. Men moving in blankets. Boots being pulled on. Walter coughing near his bedroll. Daniel somewhere beyond the horse line. Sarah looked at the broken arrangement inside the provision chest, then at the muddy ground beside the wagon. 1 set of boot marks led away, but half the camp had walked there the day before. A shadow fell across the open lid. Roy Dalton stood behind her. Problem? Sarah did not answer immediately. She looked at his face, then back at the missing supplies. Someone's been in my stores. Roy leaned over the chest. His eyebrows rose. That's a lot missing. Yes. Maybe you counted wrong. Sarah closed the lid. No. Roy gave her a slow look. Then I guess we find out who did. He walked away. Sarah watched him go. Across camp, Daniel had stopped saddling his horse. He was looking toward her. Not at the chest. At her. And for the first time since Dry Creek, the thing hidden inside Double Eagle's camp felt more dangerous than Daniel Cooper's secret. Someone wanted Sarah to fail. She did not sound an alarm. That was the first decision she made. The second was to count everything again. Sarah pulled the provision ledger from the side compartment of the chuck box, opened it across the wagon seat, and began checking the stores line by line. Coffee, flour, salt pork, dried beans, molasses, onions, peppers, bacon grease, soap, lamp oil. She wrote the missing amounts in the margin with a short pencil. 2 tins of coffee, 1 full flour sack, half of another. Enough to matter, not enough to cripple them immediately. That bothered her more. Whoever had taken the supplies had not panicked. They had chosen quantities carefully. Walter came over while she was still writing. How bad? She handed him the page. He read it twice. When did you last count? Before supper. You sure? Sarah looked at him. Walter nodded. Had to ask. I know. Roy arrived before Walter could say more. Whole camp's talking about it. Then whole camp can stop, Walter said. Roy folded his arms. We're already tight after the Ford delay. If she's losing supplies now, that becomes everybody's problem. Sarah closed the ledger. I'm not losing them. Roy looked at her. Food doesn't grow legs. No. Then either somebody took it or the count was wrong. The count wasn't wrong. Roy shrugged. Convenient. Daniel crossed the camp before Sarah could answer. What happened? Walter gave him the short version. Daniel's face did not change much. His eyes did. He looked toward the wagon, then at the ground around it. Who had access? Everybody, Sarah said. At some point. Roy gave a low laugh. That's useful. Daniel ignored him. I can ask around. Sarah closed the ledger harder than she meant to. No. Daniel looked at her. I don't need you questioning 27 men on my behalf. If somebody's stealing from the outfit, then I want to know who, so do I. Without somebody thinking they better answer because Daniel Cooper asked. Roy glanced between them. That irritated Sarah. She lowered her voice. If the only reason my name holds here is because you're standing beside it, then it doesn't hold. Daniel was quiet. Walter looked away. Sarah could see Daniel disagreeing. Not with her point. With the risk. Finally, he said, All right. Roy smiled faintly. Sarah noticed. So did Daniel. The day moved on. She shortened breakfast portions without explaining why, and adjusted supper around what remained. Nobody went hungry. That mattered. By afternoon, she had developed a system. Small chalk marks beneath the rims of flour sacks, a thread tied through the latch of the coffee box, a notation in the ledger every time something left the wagon. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious enough to warn whoever was doing it. Henry caught her counting onions. Should I be worried? Do you steal onions? No. Then probably not. He hovered. Want me to keep an eye out? Sarah looked at him. Don't make it obvious. Henry nodded with exaggerated seriousness. I can be subtle. You laughed at me from 20 feet away the first day. That was before I improved. Despite herself, Sarah smiled. Go saddle your horse. Yes, ma'am. Sarah. Right. Sarah. He left. That evening, Daniel came for coffee later than usual. He did not mention the theft. She appreciated that. He poured the cup himself. Anything? Sarah kept her eyes on the beans. Maybe. He waited. She looked over. I said maybe. Daniel nodded. That's more than nothing. You're bad at staying out of things. I am staying out. You've been standing here 3 minutes. I'm drinking coffee. Sarah glanced at his full cup. You haven't touched it. He looked down, then took a sip. Better? A little. For a moment, the tension eased. Then Roy walked past the fire and looked toward them. The ease disappeared. On the second night, nothing was missing. On the third, nothing. Sarah began wondering whether the thief had seen her marks, or whether the first theft had been enough. Then she found one of the chalk lines smeared, not broken, smeared. Someone had handled the flour sack and put it back. She checked the weight by lifting it. Lighter, not by much. 2 pounds, perhaps 3. Enough to disappear slowly. Sarah looked toward the camp. Samuel was repairing tack. Henry was carrying water. Walter and Daniel were checking the route map. Roy sat near a wagon wheel sharpening a knife. He looked up. Their eyes met. Neither moved. That night, Sarah stayed awake. She lay beside the chuck wagon under a blanket with her coat folded beneath her head. The fire burned low. Men slept. The cattle shifted on the dark ground beyond camp. Near midnight, footsteps approached. Sarah's eyes opened. She did not move. A shadow passed near the wagon, stopped, then continued. Too far away. She waited. Nothing. By morning, no additional supplies were missing. Whoever it was had either sensed something or had not come to steal. Sarah's frustration grew. The next 2 days were worse because the trail itself demanded attention. Rain turned the ground slick. One wheel sank axle-deep in mud. A horse threw a shoe. The herd split around a stand of cottonwoods and took half the morning to regroup. Sarah had no time to sit and watch boxes. She worked, counted, watched, then worked again. Daniel kept his distance as promised, but he watched her. She could feel it sometimes when she lifted her head. Not hovering, not stepping in, just there. It helped more than she wanted to admit. Late on the 5th evening, Walter brought the supply ledger to her. Not the one she used, another, older, leather-bound. Found this in the freight papers. Sarah wiped her hands and took it. What is it? Purchase record. The first few pages carried dates from before Dry Creek. Weights, prices, freight numbers, initials. Sarah turned the page, then stopped. Her initials were there. SW, beside 3 entries. Coffee, flour, salt pork. She stared. That's not mine. Walter's face was grim. I figured you'd say that. I wasn't here. I know when you joined. She looked closer. One entry was dated nearly 2 weeks before she had met Mrs. Ellis. Another showed 4 sacks of flour signed out under her initials. Roy stepped into the firelight. Found something? Sarah turned. He saw the ledger. His face changed in exactly the right way. Surprise. Concern. Maybe too exactly. Walter handed it to him. Roy read, then looked at Sarah. Those yours? No. Initials are. So are half the initials in Wyoming. Roy tapped the page. These shortages match what we're missing. Sarah's stomach tightened. Daniel appeared behind Walter. He took one look at the book. His eyes narrowed. Where'd that come from? Freight packet, Walter said. Daniel held out a hand. Roy did not give it to him immediately. That small hesitation mattered. Then he passed it over. Daniel read the entries. His thumb stopped beside one freight code. For 1 second, something flickered across his face. Recognition. Sarah saw it. What? Daniel looked up. Nothing yet. That's not nothing. He closed the ledger. Roy stepped closer. Seems simple enough. Sarah faced him. Does it? You said you know supplies. Maybe you signed for things and don't want to say where they went. Henry had wandered close. So had Samuel. Other men began noticing. The quiet spread. Sarah could feel eyes turning toward her. Roy raised the ledger. We're short provisions. Now we have records with her initials. Walter's voice hardened. Not here. Roy looked around. Why not? Everybody's eating from those stores. Sarah felt the old instinct rise. Defend yourself. Explain. Prove. She hated it. Daniel stepped forward. Sarah put out one hand. Not touching him. Stopping him. He stopped. That mattered too. Walter took the ledger back. We settle this at breakfast. Roy nodded. Fine. He walked away. The men dispersed slowly. Henry lingered. Sarah looked at him. Go. He did. Daniel stayed. Sarah closed the provision chest. You know something. Daniel's jaw tightened. I know the freight code looks wrong. How? He hesitated. Only a fraction. But Sarah saw it. Daniel. He looked at the ledger in Walter's hand. Because I've seen Double Eagle freight records before. How many? He did not answer. Walter cut in. Tomorrow. Sarah looked from one man to the other. That same old pattern. Information moving around her. Men deciding when she should receive it. She hated that almost as much as the accusation. But she said nothing. Not yet. At dawn, the crew gathered for breakfast. Nobody spoke much. Sarah served coffee and biscuits because the work still had to be done. Then Roy walked to the center of the table. He laid the leather ledger down where everyone could see it. The cover made a flat sound against the wood. Sarah looked at him. Roy opened to the marked page. He tapped the initials with one finger. SW. Every face turned toward her. Roy's voice stayed calm. Sarah, maybe you'd like to explain why the missing supplies appear under your own hand. Sarah looked at the open ledger, then at Roy, then at the men around the breakfast table. Nobody laughed now. That somehow felt worse. Henry stared down into his coffee. Samuel had both forearms on the table, his mouth drawn tight. Walter stood near the end of the wagon with one hand resting against the bench. Daniel was farther back. Still, watching. Sarah wiped her palms once against her apron. I didn't write those entries. Roy nodded as if he had expected that. Of course. Walter cut in. That's enough. Roy spread one hand. I'm not accusing her of anything Walter hasn't already seen. You are. Then say what you'd call it. Walter did not answer. The ledger sat between them. Ink did not care who was honest. Sarah stepped closer and looked at the page again. The initials were neat. Too neat. She never wrote her S that way. Hers leaned forward and ended short. Whoever had copied her initials had seen them somewhere but had not seen them enough. She pointed. That's not how I write. Roy gave a faint smile. You telling us 2 letters prove more than a purchase book. I'm telling you those aren't mine. Samuel finally looked up. When were those entries made? Walter answered. Some before Dry Creek, some after. Roy turned sharply. After? Sarah's eyes moved to him. That was the first crack. Small, but there. Walter noticed too. He closed the ledger. I'm checking all of it. Roy leaned back. Meanwhile, we're still short food. Sarah said, I can stretch what we have. You can stretch coffee? No. A few men shifted. Roy looked around the table. That's the problem. Sarah felt the weight in the room change. Until now, she had been useful enough to interrupt what some of them thought about her. Now doubt had given old habits permission to return. She saw it in the way one man glanced at the flour sacks, in the way another avoided her eyes. Not hatred, calculation. She knew that look too. Walter looked at Sarah. We'll reach the Pine Ridge stage station tomorrow afternoon. She understood before he finished. No. Walter's jaw tightened. Sarah. No. I have to settle the records before I can keep you responsible for the stores. You think I took them? I think I don't know. Her chin lifted. That's different. It is. Doesn't feel different from here. Walter let out a breath. I'll pay you through the week. You'll ride to Pine Ridge with the supply wagon. From there, you can take the eastbound stage. Henry looked up. Boss. Walter turned. Not now. Henry stopped. Sarah stood perfectly still. The fire behind her gave a soft pop. Somewhere beyond camp, a cow bawled. She reached behind her neck and untied the apron strings. The cloth came loose slowly. She folded the apron once, then again. She placed it beside the ledger. Roy watched. Sarah did not look at him. She looked at Daniel. That was the mistake. She knew it as soon as she did it. Because some part of her had still been holding one thing separate from the rest. The others could doubt. Walter could be cautious. Roy could lie. But Daniel had sat beside her fire. Daniel had trusted her at Blackwater Ford. Daniel had looked at her like her word carried weight before anybody else seemed willing to. He met her eyes. Sarah asked, Do you believe I falsified that ledger? The entire camp went quiet. Daniel's face changed. Just slightly. She saw him look toward the book, then Walter, then back at her. He knew something. She had known that since the night before. Sarah, that's not an answer. Daniel took one step forward. His hand stopped near his belt. Not reaching for her. Holding himself in place. I don't think... You don't think what? His eyes tightened. I don't think the records make sense. Then say why. He hesitated. Only 2 seconds. Maybe less. But Sarah felt every one of them. The respect Walter gave him. The telegram. The livestock buyer. The numbers. The argument behind the supply wagon. All of it sat suddenly between them. Daniel knew something he was still choosing not to tell her. Sarah's mouth went dry. Do you believe I did it? No. The answer came then. Firm, but late. Too late. She nodded once. I could take their laughter. Daniel flinched. Barely. Sarah's voice stayed low. I didn't think I'd have to take your silence. She turned away. Sarah. She kept walking. He did not follow. That was probably the right thing. It hurt anyway. She spent the rest of the morning packing. There was not much. Her carpet bag, 2 dresses, the spare stockings Mrs. Ellis had given her before the drive, her small sewing kit, a receipt from her last boarding house job folded between 2 pages of her mother's recipe notebook. The notebook had grease stains on the cover and one loose page near the back. Sarah tied the bag shut. Henry appeared beside the wagon. He stood there for a moment. "I'm sorry." She did not look up. "You didn't do it." "No. I mean, I was one of the ones laughing when you came." Sarah stopped tying the strap. Henry stared at the ground. "Feels worse now." "Why?" "Because I know better now." She looked at him. He was young enough that shame still showed honestly on his face. "Then remember it next time." He nodded. "I will." Samuel came later. He did not apologize. He simply set a small wrapped bundle beside her carpet bag. Sarah opened it. Jerky. 2 biscuits. A tin cup. "For Pine Ridge," he said. I know." The words stopped her. He looked uncomfortable. "Still need to eat." Sarah closed the bundle. "Thank you." Samuel nodded and walked away. Daniel did not come. All day she expected him to. She hated herself a little for expecting it. Toward evening, the outfit made camp early. Nobody asked Sarah to cook. Roy did it with 2 other men. The beans were thin. Nobody complained. Sarah sat near the supply wagon and watched darkness settle over the foothills. Daniel was across camp talking quietly with Walter. She could not hear them. At one point, Daniel looked toward her. She looked away first. Night came hard and cold. Sarah rolled herself into her blankets, fully dressed. She did not sleep. Hours passed. The fire burned low. Boots moved once near Walter's tent. Sarah opened her eyes. Daniel crossed the camp alone. He carried something small in one hand. He disappeared through Walter's canvas flap. Sarah sat up slightly. A lantern came alive inside. Their voices were too low to make out. Then Walter said, "You sure?" Daniel answered, "Yes." Silence. Then the sound of something metallic placed on wood. Sarah could see their shadows against the canvas. Walter's voice again. "If you do this, there's no putting it back." Daniel said, "I know." Another pause. Then clearer. "I'm done hiding it." Sarah stared at the tent. Inside, Daniel Cooper had just made a decision large enough to change the shape of the camp. She only did not know yet how much of her own life was tied to it. Before sunrise, Walter called everyone together. The men came reluctantly out of their blankets and bedrolls, pulling coats over shirts, stamping warmth back into their boots. The eastern sky was only beginning to pale. Frost lay white along the wagon tongues and saddle leather. Sarah stood beside her carpet bag. She had already packed. Walter held the leather supply ledger under one arm. Daniel stood at his right. Something was different about him, not his clothes. He wore the same gray coat and the same dark hat he had worn since Dry Creek. It was the way he stood, no longer slightly apart from the others, no longer as though he could disappear into the crew whenever he chose. Roy noticed too. "What is this?" he asked. "We losing another hour over her?" Sarah felt several men glance her way. Daniel looked at Roy. "We're settling it." Roy gave a short laugh. "You?" Walter stepped forward. "Let him finish." Roy's smile faded. Daniel took off his gloves and placed them on the wagon seat. Then he reached into his coat. The small object Sarah had heard strike Walter's table the night before appeared in his palm. A silver seal, heavy enough to catch the first gray light. There was an eagle worked into its face. Sarah had seen the same mark stamped on double eagle freight papers. Her breath slowed. Roy stared at it. "What is that supposed to prove?" Daniel looked around the circle. His voice remained the same quiet voice Sarah knew. "My name is Daniel Cooper." Henry shifted impatiently. "We know." Daniel's eyes moved to him. "No. You know part of it." Silence settled. Daniel held up the seal. "My father founded Double Eagle Ranch 31 years ago." Nobody moved. Sarah heard one of the horses snort behind them. Daniel continued. "When he died, the ranch passed to me." Roy's face changed first, then Henry's. Samuel lowered his coffee cup without drinking. Sarah did not move at all. Daniel put the seal back into his coat. "Double Eagle Ranch is mine." No one spoke. The words did not seem large enough for what they did to the camp. Roy looked at Walter. "You're joking." Walter shook his head. "I've known him since he was 12. Henry stared at Daniel. "You're the owner?" "Yes." "You've been riding herd with us?" "Yes." "Sleeping on the ground?" Daniel glanced at him. "The ground doesn't change because a man owns cattle." Samuel made a sound under his breath that might have been amusement. Roy did not. His jaw had tightened. "So this whole time you've been watching us?" Daniel's eyes settled on him. "I've been working." "Same thing, maybe." "No." Roy stepped forward. "You hide who you are, then you get to decide afterward who passed whatever test you were running." Daniel's face hardened slightly. "I wasn't testing anyone." Roy gave him a look that made it clear he did not believe that. Sarah understood the feeling, but Daniel turned toward her before Roy could continue. "This isn't why we're here." He nodded to Walter. Walter opened the leather ledger. Daniel took it. "The entries under Sarah's initials are false." Roy exhaled through his nose. "Because you say so, no." Daniel opened to the marked page. "Because this freight number belongs to a shipment delivered to Double Eagle in October." He pointed to one line. "Sarah joined this outfit in December." Roy folded his arms. "Could be a copied number." "It is." Daniel turned the page. "This one, too." Sarah stepped closer despite herself. Daniel laid the ledger on the wagon tailgate. Beside the false entries were small stamped codes she had barely noticed before. Daniel pointed. "Double Eagle freight numbers are issued in order by the ranch office. October shipments begin with 4, November with 5, December with 6. He tapped the forged entry. "This says Sarah signed for flour 3 days ago under an October code." Walter handed him another folded packet. Older receipts. Daniel opened them. The same number appeared on a receipt for a load of coffee, flour, lamp oil, and harness soap delivered months earlier. The supplier's mark was clear. Sarah looked at Roy. His face had gone still. Too still. Daniel continued. "Whoever made the false entries copied numbers from older ranch paperwork." Roy shrugged. "Then somebody forged it." "Doesn't tell you who, no." Daniel closed the book. "So we look." Roy's gaze sharpened. "Look where?" "Bedrolls, saddlebags, wagon boxes." Several men muttered. Daniel raised his voice only slightly. "Every man's. Mine included." That stopped the complaints. Walter and Samuel began the search. It did not take long. Henry's things contained 2 shirts, a dime novel, a whetstone, and 3 peppermint sticks he claimed he had forgotten about. Samuel had pipe tobacco, spare socks, fence staples, and a photograph folded inside an old envelope. Nothing. One by one, the men opened what they owned. Roy stood beside his bedroll with his hands hanging loose. Sarah watched him. Walter opened the saddlebag. Inside were gloves, a whetstone, a shirt, then a folded paper packet. Walter pulled it out. The packet carried a freight tag. Double Eagle. October. Roy's face drained. Walter looked at Daniel. Daniel did not say anything. Samuel reached deeper into the saddlebag. His hand came out holding a small coffee tin, the same brand Sarah had inventoried at Dry Creek. One of the missing tins. Henry whispered, "Lord." Roy stepped forward. "That isn't mine." Walter looked at him. "It's in your saddlebag. Somebody put it there." Sarah's eyes went to the folded freight tag, then the ledger, then Roy. "You needed the old shipment numbers." Roy turned toward her. His expression changed. The calm was gone. "You don't know anything." Daniel moved one step closer. Roy stopped. Sarah continued. "You took just enough food to make it look like bad management. Then you made the ledger." Roy laughed once. There was no humor in it. "Why would I bother?" Walter answered this time. "Your sister." Roy's head snapped toward him. Walter's face had gone cold. "You asked me in Dry Creek to give the cook contract to Evelyn." Nobody spoke. Sarah remembered. Mrs. Ellis had said Double Eagle was desperate for a cook. She had never asked who else wanted the work. Roy looked around the circle. "My sister needed that position." Daniel said, "So you framed Sarah?" "I was fixing what should have been done in the first place." Henry stared at him. "By making us think she stole?" Roy ignored him. He looked at Daniel. "You gave her the job before she earned anything." "No," Daniel said. "Walter gave her a trial. You told him to give her the keys." Sarah felt that sentence strike somewhere deep. It was true. She had heard it herself. Daniel did not deny it. "I told him to let her try. Same difference." "No." Daniel's voice sharpened for the first time. "She earned everything after that." Roy's eyes moved to Sarah. For one ugly second, she saw the same expression he had worn at the freight yard, the certainty that she had taken something that properly belonged to someone else. Walter closed Roy's saddlebag. "Pack the rest." Roy stared at him. "You're throwing me off the drive?" Daniel answered. "Yes." Roy looked at him. "After 9 years?" "After this morning." The words were quiet. Final. Roy looked as if he might argue again. Then he saw the men around him. Samuel was no longer looking uncertain. Henry looked disgusted. Even the men who had doubted Sarah were watching Roy now. He spat into the frost, rolled his blanket, and saddled his horse. Nobody helped him. Sarah stood near the wagon while he rode south. He never looked back. The camp remained quiet after he disappeared. Not peaceful, just emptied of something. Walter finally turned to Sarah. "You aren't going to Pine Ridge." She looked at him. "No." Walter nodded. "I owe you an apology." Sarah glanced toward the ledger. "You had records. I had bad records. You didn't know. I could have listened longer. That mattered." She gave one small nod. "Thank you." Then she looked at Daniel. He had not moved. The others slowly returned to work. Henry took the empty coffee tin from Samuel and carried it back toward the wagon without being asked. Walter began issuing orders. Within minutes, the drive was becoming a drive again. Sarah and Daniel were left with several yards of cold ground between them. He came closer. "Sarah." She picked up her carpetbag. Not because she was leaving, because she needed something to do with her hands. Daniel stopped. "I should have told you." "Which part?" He was quiet. Sarah looked at him. The part where you owned the ranch? Yes. Or the part where you knew those freight numbers were wrong? Both. She tightened the strap on the carpetbag. How long were you going to let me think you were somebody else? Daniel looked toward the men, then back at her. I didn't know. That's not good enough, no. The fact that he agreed irritated her more. Sarah stepped closer. At Dry Creek, I thought you were the only man there who wasn't measuring me before I opened my mouth. I wasn't, but you were hiding half of yourself while you learned everything you wanted to know about me. Daniel's face changed, only slightly. Enough. I know. Sarah swallowed. Vindication should have felt better than this. Roy was gone. Her name was clear. The men knew she had not stolen anything. And yet the person whose opinion had mattered most had suddenly become the person she understood least. She looked at him for a long moment, then asked the question that had been waiting since Walter first glanced toward him at the freight yard. Were you ever going to tell me who you were if I hadn't been accused? Daniel did not answer quickly, and this time Sarah did not look away. At last he said, I meant to. Sarah's face did not change. When? He breathed out through his nose. I don't know. Then you didn't mean to. You hoped you'd find the right moment. Daniel accepted that without arguing. Maybe. The camp moved around them. Harness buckles clicked. Walter called for the remuda. Henry rolled a bedroll tight against his knee. Somebody lifted the breakfast kettle from the coals. Sarah heard all of it. What she heard most clearly was Daniel refusing to make his answer prettier than it was. Why hide it at all? She asked. Daniel looked toward the herd. My father spent more time horseback than he ever spent behind a desk. He used to say a man could own 10,000 acres and still know nothing about them if he only saw them through account books. So you became one of your own hands, sometimes, without telling them. Yes. Why? Daniel rubbed one thumb along the seam of his glove. Because men talk differently around the owner. Sarah gave a small, humorless smile. Exactly. He looked at her. You get to hear what they really think. You get to see who works and who doesn't. You get to decide what kind of men they are while they don't get the same chance with you. Daniel's jaw tightened. She continued. You knew I was desperate for work. You knew what Roy thought of me. You knew I thought you were just another man riding beside the herd. I never lied about caring what happened to you. No. That stopped her for half a second. The truth of it was inconvenient. Daniel had hidden his money. He had not hidden his attention. Sarah folded her arms against the cold. But you did let me tell you things I might have said differently if I'd known who you were. Daniel's eyes held hers. I know, you keep saying that, because you're right. She looked away. It would have been easier if he had defended himself badly, easier if he had claimed the secret was for her protection or insisted wealth did not matter. Instead, he stood there and let the weight remain where it belonged. Walter called, "Mount up!" The conversation ended because the trail demanded it. Sarah put her carpetbag back beneath the wagon seat. Daniel stepped aside. He did not offer to lift it. That small restraint hurt almost as much as it pleased her. The drive moved north. For 2 days, Sarah and Daniel spoke only when work required it. Water's shallow at the next creek. Coffee's ready. Wheels holding. Storm west. Nothing more. The quiet between them had changed. Before, silence had felt easy. Now it had edges. The country changed too. The mountains opened into a broad valley where the grass lay pale beneath a thin crust of snow. Fence lines began appearing. Real fence lines, miles of them, running over hills and disappearing into the distance. Sarah noticed the Double Eagle brand burned into gateposts, 2 letters carved beneath a spread-winged eagle. They passed the first-line cabin near noon, then a hayfield, then a long set of corrals. By late afternoon, the main ranch came into view. Sarah pulled the team slower without meaning to. Double Eagle Ranch was larger than anything she had imagined. The main house stood on a low rise, 2 stories of heavy timber and pale stone, with a porch stretching across the front. Behind it were barns, bunkhouses, sheds, a blacksmith shop, a smokehouse, grain storage, and corrals large enough to hold hundreds of cattle. Men came out to meet the drive. A ranch bell rang. Dogs barked. Smoke lifted from 3 chimneys. Sarah looked toward Daniel. He had changed nothing. Same saddle, same coat, same tired horse. But men at the gate straightened when he rode through. One removed his hat. "Mr. Cooper." Daniel nodded. "Evening, Ben." Another man came from the main house carrying a ledger under one arm. He was around 50, thin, neatly dressed, wire spectacles low on his nose. "Daniel." "Thomas." The man looked past him toward the herd. "You're 4 days later than I wanted. River was up, I heard." His eyes moved toward Sarah and then back to Daniel. "So that's the cook?" Sarah heard the question. Daniel answered carefully. "That's Sarah Whitmore." "Not the cook." Sarah noticed. Thomas Reed approached her wagon. "I'm Thomas Reed. I keep the accounts." "Sarah, I've heard the drive ate better than usual. Depends who you ask." Thomas glanced toward Samuel. Samuel called from his horse, "Ask anybody with sense." Sarah almost smiled. Daniel dismounted. Walter joined him near the gate. Men began sorting cattle into the lower corrals. Sarah had work immediately. Of course she did. There were pots to unload, food stores to inventory, wagon supplies to compare against the ranch kitchen, and 27 tired men expecting supper. Work saved her from thinking. For a few hours, after the meal, Walter found her in the large ranch kitchen. The room was far bigger than the chuck wagon setup. 2 work tables, a cast iron range, shelves of crockery, hooks for pans, a pantry behind a heavy wooden door. Sarah stood with a pencil behind one ear, counting flour sacks. Walter leaned against the doorframe. "Daniel wants to talk to you tomorrow." She kept counting. "About what?" "Permanent work." Her hand stopped. "Here?" "Kitchen, stores, trail provisioning. Year-round." Sarah turned. "Did he tell you to offer it?" "No, he said he wanted to." "Same problem." Walter studied her. "You planning to leave?" "I don't know, Fair." He pushed away from the frame. "For what it's worth, I would have asked you to stay." Before Daniel said anything, Walter nodded. The records speak, that mattered, but not enough. Daniel came the next morning. Sarah was alone in the kitchen cutting salt pork for breakfast. He stopped inside the doorway. "Can we talk?" "You already are." He almost smiled. It disappeared quickly. "I want you to stay." Sarah set the knife down. "As what?" "Permanent food manager for Double Eagle. Kitchen, purchasing, winter storage, trail provisioning. More responsibility than what you had on the drive. And who decides my wages?" "I do. Who decides whether I keep the position?" His expression changed. "I do." Sarah wiped her hands. "Then no." Daniel went still. "Sarah, no." He did not move closer. She appreciated that. "You told me I earned everything after Dry Creek," she said. "If I take this job from you now, every man on this ranch gets to wonder whether I earned it or whether you wanted me close. They already know your work. Some do. That shouldn't matter. It does." Daniel looked toward the pantry shelves. She could see him working through the answer. His first instinct was still authority, fixing the problem because he had the power to fix it. Then he stopped. What would make it fair? Sarah was quiet. "A decision you don't control." Daniel nodded slowly. That afternoon, he called Walter and Thomas into the ranch office. Sarah did not know what was said. She learned the result at supper. Thomas found her near the stove. "We're opening the position." She looked at him. "To who?" "Anyone qualified." "You're serious." "Walter and I will make the selection." "And Daniel?" "We'll stay out of it." Sarah's eyes moved across the room. Daniel sat at the far end of the table eating with the men. He did not look at her. Thomas continued. "We've sent word to 2 nearby outfits and into Dry Creek. Interviews in 3 days." Sarah nodded. "All right." Thomas adjusted his spectacles. "You'll apply?" "Yes." "Good." He walked away. Daniel still did not look over. That was how she knew he had meant it. 3 days later, the applicants arrived. One was a widow from a stage stop east of the ranch. Another was a man who had cooked logging camps in Colorado. The third had worked for a cattle outfit outside Casper. Sarah watched them come through the gate with bags and references. For the first time since Dry Creek, she felt uncertain about whether she would still have a place when the week ended. That evening, she returned to the small room Walter had given her beside the ranch kitchen. Her carpetbag sat beneath the bed. Sarah pulled it out. She folded her spare dress, her stockings, her mother's recipe notebook. Then she closed the bag and fastened the straps. If Double Eagle chose someone else, she would leave without making Daniel solve it. Outside her window, boots crossed the porch. They stopped. Sarah looked toward the door. No knock came. After a moment, the steps continued. She knew whose they were. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed with the packed carpetbag at her feet. For once, Daniel Cooper was keeping exactly the distance she had asked for, and she had not expected that distance to feel quite so lonely. Sarah slept little. Before sunrise, she was back in the kitchen with her sleeves rolled and the stove warming beneath a fresh load of split pine. The 3 applicants had rooms in the bunkhouse annex, and Walter had told them all to be ready by 8. Sarah had no intention of waiting around nervously. There were biscuits to make, coffee to grind, beans to soak for supper. Work had carried her through worse mornings than this one. By 7:30, Thomas Reed appeared with a ledger tucked under one arm. "Interview first or practical test first?" Sarah asked. Thomas adjusted his spectacles. "Both." Walter came in behind him. "You'll go last." Sarah looked at the other applicants through the open doorway. "Why?" "So no one can say you knew the questions before they did." She nodded. "Fair." Daniel was nowhere in sight. That, too, was deliberate. The first applicant was Mrs. Jane Parker, a widow who had run a stage-stop kitchen near Laramie. She was quick with figures and knew how to stretch dried meat through bad weather. The second was Frank Mullins, the Colorado camp cook. Big voice, bigger confidence. He could feed 60 lumbermen and apparently wanted everyone within hearing distance to know it. The third was Edwin Shaw, a quiet man from outside Casper who had cooked for trail crews for almost a decade. Sarah listened only when she could not avoid hearing them. Then Walter called her in. The ranch office smelled of paper, wood smoke, and saddle oil. Thomas sat behind the desk. Walter stood by the window. On the table lay supply lists, old receipts, freight invoices, and 3 pages of figures. No Daniel. Thomas pointed to the chair. Sarah sat. Spring branding, he said. 40 hands for 12 days. Beef available from the ranch. Flour must be ordered from town. Coffee price rises 15%. Show me how you'd adjust. Sarah looked at the figures. How far from the nearest reliable mill? 38 miles. Wagon capacity? Thomas's mouth moved faintly. Good question. They gave her the number. She worked, not quickly, carefully. She reduced waste first, reused drippings, shifted one meal toward beans and cornmeal, calculated how much coffee could be stretched without making it thin enough to start a mutiny. Walter watched her pencil move. Then came winter storage. How much flour could be kept dry? What had to be rotated first? How much salt pork could safely sit through deep cold? How to account for 2 weeks when a road might be completely impassable? Sarah answered from experience. Not theory. Thomas brought out her cattle drive records. These are yours? Yes. You used 11% less flour than Double Eagle used on a comparable drive last year. I burned less. Walter looked at her. Except those biscuits on day 3. Sarah gave him a look. Walter coughed into his fist to hide a smile. Thomas continued. Coffee usage was lower too. I stopped letting Henry fill his cup to the brim and throw half of it out when it went cold. From the doorway came Henry's offended voice. I only did that twice. Nobody had heard him arrive. Walter pointed down the hall. Out. Henry disappeared. Thomas's mouth twitched. The interview lasted nearly an hour. At the end, he closed the ledger. Thank you. Sarah stood. That's it? That's it. She went back to the kitchen. The waiting was worse than the interview. By noon, all 4 applicants had been tested. By 2, Mrs. Parker had left for Dry Creek with a freight wagon. Frank Mullins went next, muttering something about Colorado wages being better anyway. Edwin Shaw remained until nearly 3. Then Sarah saw him shake Walter's hand and walk toward the stable. Her stomach tightened. Thomas entered the kitchen carrying a folded sheet of paper. He set it on the work table. Sarah looked at it. What is that? Your offer. She did not touch it immediately. Thomas nodded toward the page. Read it. Sarah unfolded the sheet. Permanent position. Year-round salary. Authority over kitchen stores, trail provisioning, food purchasing within budget, and seasonal assistance. Her eyes moved to the wage, higher than she expected. Not absurdly high. Just fair. She looked at Thomas. Daniel knows? No. She frowned. He doesn't know who you picked? He told us not to tell him until after you were told. Walter entered behind Thomas. You had the best numbers. Sarah looked at him. Not because... No. Walter cut her off. Not because of him. Thomas tapped one line with a finger. Your drive records saved more money than any applicant could promise us they might save. Sarah looked down again. Something in her chest loosened. Slowly. Quietly. She signed. Not with a flourish. Just Sarah Whitmore in steady black ink. That evening, Daniel came into the kitchen after supper. He stopped when he saw the signed copy of the agreement pinned near Thomas's supply board. His eyes moved to Sarah. You took it. I earned it. Yes. There was no pride in his voice that belonged to himself. Only recognition. Sarah appreciated that. She folded a dish towel. That doesn't mean everything's settled between us. I know. I'm serious. So am I. She looked at him. He did not step closer, did not smile, did not ask for more. Good, she said. Daniel nodded once. Then he picked up his coffee and left. 3 days later, 2 new hands arrived from Cheyenne. Young men, strong backs, loud voices. Sarah barely noticed them at first. She had inventory to reorganize before the next supply wagon. Late that afternoon, she crossed behind the stable carrying a list for Thomas. The 2 new men were near the tack room door. One looked toward her, said something low. The other laughed. Sarah caught enough. A remark about her size. Old, familiar, tired. She stopped. Before she could turn, another voice cut across the stable yard. Samuel Price. You two planning to eat here? The laughter died. One of the men shrugged. Sure. Samuel stepped closer. Then show some sense. The first man frowned. We were only joking. No. Samuel's voice stayed flat. You were making noise. He pointed toward the kitchen. She fed 28 men through a winter drive, kept stores when half of you couldn't keep count of your own socks, and caught a thief before the rest of us knew what was missing. Sarah stood around the corner, unseen. Samuel continued. You've got a complaint about her work. Bring one worth hearing. Neither man answered. Otherwise, shut your mouths and do yours. Samuel walked off. Sarah stayed where she was for a moment. Daniel was nowhere nearby. Walter wasn't either. Nobody had ordered Samuel to say it. That mattered more than she expected. That night, she poured 2 cups of coffee, one for herself, one for Daniel. She found him sitting on the main house porch with a stack of papers beside him and a pencil tucked behind one ear. He looked up when she approached. Sarah held out the cup. He took it. Thank you. She sat beside him. Not close, not far. Daniel looked at the coffee, then at her. He did not ask what had changed. Smart man. For several minutes they said nothing. Wind moved along the porch rail. A horse stamped somewhere in the lower corral. Daniel opened his mouth. Sarah turned slightly toward him. Then hoofbeats came hard through the front gate. Fast. Wrong for that hour. A rider pulled up so sharply the horse slid in the mud. Walter came out of the bunkhouse. The rider nearly fell from the saddle. North Ridge, he gasped. 5 men trapped beyond it. Daniel was already standing. The rider dragged in air. Storm came down early, trails gone white. Sarah looked toward the mountains. She had not noticed the clouds gathering beyond them. Now she could see them. Dark, low, moving fast. The first snowflake struck the porch rail and melted. Then another. Daniel set down the coffee she had brought him. How long? Maybe an hour before the pass closes completely. Walter swore under his breath. Daniel looked at Sarah. No secrets now. No distance. Only the thing in front of them. Get the kitchen ready, he said. Sarah was already moving. She crossed the yard at a run, skirts gathered in one hand, boots striking the frozen boards of the porch. By the time she reached the kitchen, the wind had started pushing snow sideways across the windows. The first thing she did was add wood to both stoves. The second was put every large kettle on. Water, coffee, broth, nothing fancy. Warmth first. She sent Henry to the linen room for blankets and told Thomas to bring every lantern and spare oil tin he could find. Samuel came through the back door carrying 2 armloads of split wood before she asked. Stack it inside, Sarah said. He nodded. Outside, men were already saddling horses. Daniel stood in the yard, with Walter and 4 riders, heads bent together against the wind. The storm was thickening by the minute. Snow caught in Daniel's hat brim and along the shoulders of his coat. Sarah watched only long enough to see him point north. Then she turned back to the stove. There was no room for fear yet. Fears could wait until something useful had been done with it. By dusk, the main dining room no longer looked like a dining room. Benches had been moved against the walls. Blankets lay folded near the hearth. Buckets of hot water stood ready. Sarah put clean cloths, soap, scissors, and bandages on one end of the long table. She had no doctor, and she did not pretend to be one. But cold men came home needing dry clothes, warm drink, and somewhere safe to lie down. If someone came back hurt, they would at least be ready. The first search party returned after 3 hours, without the missing men. Daniel dismounted stiffly. Snow covered him from hat to boots. Sarah met him inside the mudroom. Anything? Tracks. Lost them near the cedar cut. Eat. No time. She handed him a cup. Then drink. He took it. 3 swallows. That was all. Walter came through the door behind him. Winds shifting east. Daniel looked toward the window. Good or bad? Bad if they're still above the ridge. Sarah wanted to ask how bad. She did not. Daniel set the cup down. Their hands brushed. Neither spoke. Then he went back out. Night settled hard. The snow deepened against the porch steps. Sarah could no longer see the lower corral from the kitchen window. Men came and went in bursts. A rider returned with a cut over one eyebrow and fingers too numb to undo his own coat buttons. Sarah sat him near the stove and poured warm coffee while Samuel worked the buckles loose. Another horse came back riderless. That silenced the room. Daniel had not been on it. Sarah knew that immediately. The saddle belonged to one of the missing hands. Walter examined the reins. Snapped loose. Nobody said what else it might mean. Sarah picked up the coffee pot and filled the cups again. Around midnight, the front door slammed open. Got one! Men rushed in. A cowboy named Lewis was half carried between Daniel and Henry. His left leg dragged. His face was pale beneath windburn. Table, Sarah said. They lowered him carefully onto the long dining table. Daniel stripped off his own gloves. Sarah saw his hands. Red. Shaking. Where are the others? She asked. Still out. Lewis tried to speak. Sarah bent closer. Cabin, he whispered. Old line cabin. 3 made it there. Jake went after the loose horses. Daniel looked at Walter. Where? North Draw. Lewis nodded faintly. Daniel was already turning. Sarah caught his sleeve. He stopped. Not because she pulled hard, because it was her hand. You're frozen through. I've got dry gloves. Your coat is soaked. I'll change it. Eat something first. His eyes held hers. The room around them moved. Walter gave orders. Samuel cut away part of Lewis's trouser leg. Henry carried in more wood. But for 1 second, Sarah and Daniel stood still. You come back, she said. It was not a plea. It sounded almost like an order. Daniel looked at her hand on his sleeve, then at her face. I will. She let go. He kept the promise the only way he could. By leaving again. The next hours blurred. Sarah worked until time stopped making sense. She heated broth, counted blankets, changed lantern wicks, kept coffee from boiling bitter, helped Lewis sit up long enough to drink. The storm hammered the roof. Once, around 3 in the morning, the wind struck so hard the kitchen door shook in its frame. Thomas came in carrying a stack of account paper. Sarah stared at him. What am I supposed to do with that? He looked down. Thought they were towels. For the first time all night, she laughed. One short sound. Thomas did too. Then the wind rose again, and both stopped. Near dawn, another party returned. 2 men this time, one walking, one slumped over a saddle. Sarah ran to the mudroom. Daniel came in behind them. She saw his face and knew before he spoke. Still 2 missing. Sarah took his gloves. He did not resist. They were stiff with ice. Names? Caleb Moore. Jake Turner. She set the gloves near the stove. Where were the others? Line cabin. So those 2 may be near it. Maybe. He looked older than he had the day before. Not by years, by hours. Sarah pushed a cup toward him. He wrapped both hands around it. They trembled. He looked down at them as if annoyed. Sarah covered one of his hands with hers, only for a second. Drink. He did. Then Walter called from the doorway. Daniel stood. Sarah removed her hand. No one mentioned it. The second day came gray and merciless. The storm eased briefly at noon, then returned. The ranch became a place of waiting. Every hoofbeat pulled eyes toward the windows. Every opening door stopped conversation. Sarah began measuring time by the coffee pot. One fresh pot, then another, then another. Late afternoon brought Caleb. Alive, half frozen. He had sheltered beneath a fallen pine after losing his horse. One missing now. Jake Turner. The storm weakened after dark. Daniel refused to stop. Walter finally stood in front of his horse. You're exhausted. So is Jake. You fall out there, I lose 2 men. Daniel looked at him. Walter did not move. Sarah stood on the porch behind them. Snow blew around her skirts. Daniel saw her. Something in his expression changed. Not surrender. Calculation. He nodded once. 2 hours. Walter stepped aside. Daniel took a fresh horse. Sarah walked down the steps. She held out a wrapped bundle. Bread. Jerky. A small flask of coffee. He took it. You planned that. I know you. That stopped him. Sarah heard the words after they were already out. Daniel looked at her for one long second. Then he tucked the bundle into his coat. I'll be back. Sarah nodded. This time she believed him because she had decided to. He rode into the dark. The final wait was the worst. No work left to invent. No more blankets to fold. No more water to heat. Sarah sat near the kitchen window with untouched coffee cooling beside her. Walter paced once every few minutes. Samuel slept sitting upright against the wall. Thomas had given up pretending to read. It was nearly dawn when Henry shouted from the yard. Horses! Everyone moved. Sarah reached the porch first. 3 shapes appeared through the thinning snow. Daniel, another rider, and between them, a third horse carrying a man hunched forward beneath a blanket. Jake. Alive. The ranch erupted into motion. Men ran for the gate. Walter shouted for help. Sarah stepped back and let them bring Jake inside. Daniel entered last. His face was white with cold. He removed his hat. For the first time since the storm began, nobody needed anything from him. All 5 missing men were home, all accounted for. He walked to the table, sat. Sarah poured coffee. He reached for it. His hand shook so badly the cup rattled against the saucer. He stopped, looked at his fingers. Sarah sat across from him. Then she placed her hand over his. Not to steady the cup, just his hand. Daniel looked up. There was no owner of Double Eagle in his face now. No hidden rancher. No man trying to prove anything. Only Daniel. Exhausted. Cold. Present. Sarah tightened her fingers once. His hand turned beneath hers, palm to palm. Neither spoke. Around them, the ranch slowly breathed again. Someone laughed weakly in the hall. A kettle began to whistle. Outside, the snow had finally stopped. Several hours later, after the injured men were settled and the ranch had gone quiet, Daniel found Sarah alone in the kitchen. She was cleaning a coffee stain from the table. He stood in the doorway. "Sarah." She looked up. He seemed unsure of himself. That was rare. "Before sunrise tomorrow," he said, "would you meet me in the dining room?" Her hand stopped on the cloth. "Why?" He looked at her steadily. "Because there's one thing left I don't want to hide behind silence." Sarah held his gaze, then nodded. "All right." Daniel left. Sarah stood alone beside the table as the first clear stars in 2 days appeared beyond the kitchen window. For the first time, she was not afraid of what he might say. She was afraid of how much she wanted to hear it. Sarah woke before the kitchen fire needed tending. The ranch was still dark. Outside her window, the storm had left the yard buried in clean snow. The wind had gone. Every fence rail, wagon tongue, and roof edge held a white line under the moon. She dressed slowly. Not because she was uncertain, because she wanted her hands to stop trembling. By the time she crossed into the dining room, a faint gray light had begun touching the eastern windows. Daniel was already there. He stood near the cold hearth with his hat in both hands. No coat, no papers, no ranch ledger. Nothing between them that could be used as an excuse. Sarah stopped a few feet away. "You said there was something you wouldn't hide behind silence." Daniel looked at her, yes. She waited. He drew a breath. "I love you." The words were plain, almost severe in their simplicity. Sarah looked toward the window. A pale strip of morning lay over the mountains. Daniel continued before she could answer. "I'm not saying that because of the storm. And I'm not saying it because I think you need something from me." Sarah folded her hands loosely in front of her. "Good." His mouth moved slightly. "I figured you'd say that. You figured right." He looked down at his hat. "I've spent most of my life believing if I worked hard enough, I could keep control of the things that mattered. Rancher habit. Probably." He lifted his eyes. "But you're not something I can manage. No. You're not something I can give a position to and call the matter settled. No. You're not something I can keep." Sarah's gaze sharpened. Daniel nodded. "I know." The room went quiet. Then he said, "What I want is simpler than that and harder." Sarah's fingers tightened slightly. "What?" "I want to know whether the life you're building here has room for me in it." That was not what she had expected. No promise of comfort. No offer to move her into the big house. No talk of money. Just a question. Sarah looked at him for a long time. "When I came to Dry Creek," she said, "I had $11, one bad pair of boots, and enough pride to make most situations harder than they needed to be." Daniel gave the smallest smile. "I remember the boots. They were terrible. They were." She looked down. "I was used to doing everything alone because that was safer than depending on someone who might decide I was too much trouble." Daniel did not interrupt. "I don't want to lose that part of myself," she said. "The part that knows how to stand on her own. I don't want you to, I mean it." "So do I." Sarah looked at him again. "And if I stay here, I work." "Yes." "I make decisions." "Yes." "My position doesn't belong to you." "No." "And if you disagree with me in front of everyone, I'll disagree with you in front of everyone." That surprised a laugh out of her. Daniel's shoulders loosened. Sarah stepped closer. What if I tell you you're wrong? I've survived it before. Not gracefully. No. She smiled. Then the smile faded into something quieter. I don't know exactly what this becomes. Daniel nodded. Neither do I. I won't promise you forever because we've had one hard winter and one worse storm. I wouldn't believe you if you did. That earned him another look. Then he said, But I'd like the chance to walk beside you while we find out. Sarah felt the old instinct rise. Hold back. Wait. Protect the part nobody could take if she never offered it. She had lived by that instinct for years. It had kept her standing. It had also kept every door closed. Sarah stepped forward. Daniel did not move. That mattered. He waited until she chose the distance. She reached up, caught the front of his shirt lightly between two fingers, and kissed him. It was not dramatic. No storm outside, no music, no watching crowd. Just warmth after a long, cold season. Daniel's hand lifted toward her waist, then stopped before touching. Sarah felt the hesitation. She took his wrist and placed his hand there herself. Only then did he hold her. When they parted, his forehead rested briefly against hers. Neither said anything. They did not need to. Months passed. Spring came late and muddy, then summer arrived all at once. The Double Eagle kitchen changed under Sarah's hands. She reorganized the dry stores, hired 2 women from Dry Creek for branding season, changed the purchasing schedule so flour arrived before the roads turned bad, kept proper receipts in a wooden box marked by month because Thomas Reed had nearly lost his patience with loose scraps of paper. By autumn, nobody called her the new cook. She was simply Sarah. If a trail crew was leaving, men came to her for provisions. If stores ran low, Walter asked her opinion before sending a wagon to town. If Thomas disputed a price, Sarah usually had the receipt. Daniel kept working cattle. He still rode with the crews, still slept in line cabins when work carried him too far from the main house. Still came into the kitchen for coffee, and occasionally forgot that being the owner did not excuse muddy boots. The first time he tracked dirt across a freshly scrubbed floor, Sarah handed him the mop. Henry nearly choked, laughing. Daniel cleaned it. Their courtship became known without announcement. At first, men noticed when Daniel sat beside Sarah at supper. Then they stopped noticing. That was the part she liked best. Nothing had to become a spectacle. Winter returned almost a year after she first arrived in Dry Creek. The first hard cold settled overnight. Sarah woke to frost thick on the kitchen windows and horses breathing steam in the corrals. She had just finished the morning bread when she heard a wagon outside, not one of theirs. Sarah wiped her hands and stepped onto the porch. A small freight wagon had stopped near the front gate. A young woman climbed down. She could not have been more than 20. Her coat was too thin for the weather. A bundle was tied beneath one arm. She stood beside the wagon uncertainly while the driver turned his team and left. 2 new ranch hands near the stable looked over. One said something under his breath. The other started to laugh. Samuel Price appeared behind them. The laughter stopped. Sarah noticed. So did the young woman. Sarah walked down the porch steps. "Can I help you?" The woman tightened her grip on the bundle. "I'm looking for work." Sarah stopped. For one strange second, she was back in Dry Creek. Carpetbag at her feet, bad boots, 28 men already deciding what she could not do. The young woman's eyes carried the same preparation Sarah remembered. The look of someone expecting rejection before the answer came. Sarah did not tell her everything would be fine. Did not offer charity. Did not ask what had happened to her. Not yet. She simply opened the kitchen door wider. "What can you do?" The young woman's face changed. Only a little. Enough. I can sew, she said. Cook some. Keep accounts if the numbers aren't too complicated. Numbers are always complicated. The woman almost smiled. Sarah stepped aside. Come inside. It's warmer. Across the yard, Daniel stood beside a saddled horse. He had been waiting at the gate. Their eyes met. He did not call for her. He did not hurry her. He simply waited. Sarah turned back to the young woman. There's coffee on the stove. Have a cup. Walter will want to speak with you after breakfast. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You haven't worked a day. That brought a real smile. Sarah pulled on her coat and stepped outside again. The ranch was fully awake now. Smoke rose straight from the chimney into the bitter air. Men called across the corrals. A hammer struck metal at the blacksmith shed. Somewhere behind the barn, Henry was arguing with a mule. The mountains stood pale beyond the valley. Daniel held out one hand when she reached him. Sarah stopped. For a heartbeat, she remembered the woman she had been. The one who believed needing nobody was the same thing as being free. Maybe it had been necessary once, but necessary was not always the same as permanent. Sarah put her hand in his. Daniel closed his fingers around hers. Not tight, just enough. Together they walked toward the horses. Behind them, the kitchen door remained open. Ahead of them, the open range waited beneath a clean winter sky. Sarah had not found a place where life became easy. She had found a place where her work carried weight, where her voice carried weight, where the man beside her did not need her smaller in order to feel strong, and where staying was no longer something that happened because she had nowhere else to go. It was something she chose. Now imagine standing where Sarah once stood, with one worn bag in your hand, and a room full of strangers already measuring your worth before you've spoken. Imagine learning to trust again after being laughed at, falsely accused, and wounded by the silence of the one person you hoped would stand beside you. Sarah never needed Daniel to rescue her. She needed something harder to find, a man willing to respect the strength she already possessed. And Daniel needed a second chance, not because he was wealthy enough to buy one, but because he was humble enough to earn one. Maybe that's why their story stays with us. Love isn't always the person who carries you when you're weak. Sometimes it's the person who sees you standing on your own and quietly asks if there's room beside you. Sarah came west believing survival meant carrying every burden alone. She stayed because she discovered that accepting someone's hand doesn't erase your strength when taking that hand is your own choice. If you were Sarah, after the secrecy, the accusation, and the long road back to trust, would you have chosen Daniel? Tell me in the comments. And if stories about second chances, quiet courage, and love earned slowly still mean something to you, subscribe and stay a while. There are more stories waiting down the trail, some mysterious, some heartbreaking, and some that may leave a little healing behind.